The Tower of London has long occupied a complex position within English historical memory, functioning simultaneously as royal residence, military stronghold, treasury, and prison. While popular narratives often emphasize the confinement of male political figures, surviving records indicate that noblewomen also experienced imprisonment within its walls, frequently under circumstances shaped by dynastic instability, accusations of treason, religious conflict, and courtly factionalism. Their confinement rarely resembled common incarceration. Instead, it reflected a negotiated form of captivity shaped by status, political usefulness, and the shifting calculations of monarchs seeking both control and legitimacy. Medieval and early modern administrative records reveal that noblewomen were typically held in apartments rather than cells, often attended by a reduced household. Chroniclers noted that the distinction between imprisonment and guarded residence could be ambiguous. The tower's internal spaces allowed for varying degrees of comfort, depending on the perceived threat posed by the prisoner and the resources allocated for their maintenance. Wardrobe accounts and provisioning records suggest that some noblewomen continued to receive fine clothing, writing materials, and food consistent with aristocratic expectations, even as their movement remained restricted and their correspondence monitored. The reasons for imprisonment were diverse, but commonly connected to political vulnerability. Dynastic disputes frequently placed noblewomen in positions where their lineage represented both value and danger. Surviving diplomatic correspondence suggests that royal authorities viewed highborn women as potential focal points for rebellion, marriage alliances, or claims to legitimacy. Their confinement therefore functioned less as punishment for personal wrongdoing and more as a preventative measure within broader strategies of governance. In this context, imprisonment was a mechanism of containment aimed at neutralizing alternative centers of loyalty. The experiences of women such as Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard illustrate the Tower's role during moments of acute political crisis. Contemporary accounts describe how Anne Boleyn entered the Tower in 1536 through Traitor's Gate, a ceremonial passage that underscored both royal authority and the gravity of treason accusations. Witness testimonies and court documents indicate that she was housed in apartments previously prepared for her coronation, a striking juxtaposition that chroniclers later interpreted as symbolic of the volatility of Tudor favor. The conditions of her confinement included the presence of attendants chosen not for comfort but for surveillance, reflecting a calculated environment where emotional isolation reinforced legal proceedings already underway. Legal records from Anne Boleyn's trial reveal the extent to which noblewomen's imprisonment intersected with the machinery of state justice. Charges were constructed within frameworks of treason law that allowed for broad interpretation, particularly when political expediency demanded decisive outcomes. Historians have noted that the Tower served as both holding site and stage, where interrogations, examinations, and preparations for trial unfolded under controlled circumstances. For noblewomen, the psychological dimension of confinement was intensified by awareness that their fate was inseparable from court politics beyond their reach. The case of Lady Jane Grey further demonstrates the Tower's dual identity as both sanctuary and prison. Proclaimed queen in 1553 amid a succession crisis, Jane initially entered the Tower as a monarch, only to become its prisoner days later following Mary I's successful claim. Surviving letters attributed to Jane suggest a confinement marked by intellectual reflection, religious devotion, and gradual recognition of political realities. Government records indicate that her imprisonment was characterized by negotiation between mercy and deterrence, with her continued existence representing both a potential rallying point for Protestant resistance and a moral dilemma for the crown. Religious upheaval during the Reformation significantly increased the likelihood of noblewomen encountering confinement within the Tower. Contemporary accounts describe how women associated with reformist or Catholic networks could be detained as authorities sought to suppress dissent. Examination records preserved in state papers reveal interrogations focused not only on personal belief, but also on correspondence, patronage networks, and household affiliations. The domestic sphere, traditionally perceived as separate from formal politics, became a site of suspicion where noblewomen's roles as patrons, correspondents, and family matriarchs acquired political implications. The material conditions of imprisonment varied considerably. Financial documents indicate that wealthier prisoners could sometimes finance improvements to their quarters, including furnishings, heating, and expanded servant attendance. Conversely, When prisoners fell from favor or lacked influential advocates, restrictions tightened. Chroniclers noted that limitations on visitors and communication were among the most significant hardships, particularly for women accustomed to social interaction and familial oversight. The Tower's physical isolation from the broader urban environment reinforced this separation, creating a controlled space where information flowed primarily through official channels. Surviving petitions submitted by imprisoned noblewomen provide insight into their strategies for navigating captivity. These documents frequently emphasized loyalty, lineage, and appeals to mercy, reflecting an understanding that release depended on political recalculation rather than legal vindication alone. Historians have observed that such petitions were carefully crafted performances of obedience, intended to reassure authorities while preserving personal dignity. The act of writing itself became a crucial mechanism through which imprisoned women attempted to influence perceptions beyond the Tower's walls. Pregnancy, health, and familial responsibilities further complicated the experience of imprisonment. Medical accounts and correspondence occasionally reference concerns about childbirth within confinement, highlighting the intersection of personal vulnerability and political significance. The potential birth of heirs could transform a prisoner's status, prompting heightened surveillance or, in some cases, temporary leniency. The Crown's approach to these situations often reflected broader anxieties regarding succession and legitimacy, underscoring how the bodies of noblewomen were entangled with the continuity of dynastic power. The Tower also functioned as a site of negotiation between public spectacle and controlled secrecy. Executions of noblewomen, though relatively rare, were highly managed events designed to communicate authority while minimizing unrest. Contemporary narratives describing these executions often emphasized composure, piety, and ritual, suggesting that expectations of noble conduct persisted even at the moment of death. Scholars have argued that these representations served political purposes, reinforcing ideals of order and obedience while obscuring the coercive mechanisms underlying the process. Not all noblewomen faced execution or lifelong confinement. In many instances, imprisonment concluded with release, exile, or transfer to supervised households. Government correspondence indicates that such outcomes were frequently contingent upon changing alliances, marriages arranged to neutralize political risk, or shifting priorities within the royal court. Release did not necessarily signify restoration of autonomy. Rather, it often marked a transition into alternative forms of surveillance embedded within aristocratic society. The psychological dimensions of confinement are more difficult to reconstruct, but can be inferred through letters, devotional writings, and reported behavior. Surviving texts suggest that religious practice provided a framework through which many imprisoned women interpreted their circumstances. Prayer, scripture reading, and correspondence with spiritual advisors appear frequently in records, indicating attempts to impose meaning and maintain identity amid uncertainty. Historians have noted that these practices also offered a socially acceptable means of emotional expression within environments where overt resistance carried significant risk. The Tower's enduring symbolic power stems partly from these layered experiences of noblewomen whose imprisonment reflected broader tensions within English governance. Their presence within the fortress illustrates how authority was exercised not solely through battlefield conflict or parliamentary decree, but through controlled confinement of individuals whose lineage, alliances, and potential influence posed challenges to stability. The Tower's walls contain not only prisoners, but also unresolved questions of legitimacy, loyalty, and succession that shaped the trajectory of the English monarchy. Architectural studies of the Tower complex reveal how space itself contributed to the experience of confinement. The arrangement of apartments, guard posts, and restricted courtyards created an environment where visibility and privacy were carefully managed. Noble prisoners could observe ceremonial life within the fortress while remaining excluded from participation, reinforcing a sense of proximity to power combined with enforced detachment. This spatial dynamic underscored the broader political message of imprisonment. Proximity to authority did not guarantee security. Over time, the stories of noblewomen imprisoned in the Tower contributed to evolving cultural perceptions of female political agency. Historical records demonstrate that their confinement was rarely passive. Rather, it involved continuous negotiation, adaptation, and strategic communication. Even within restrictive conditions, noblewomen engaged with legal processes, cultivated alliances, and attempted to shape narratives surrounding their fate. Their experiences highlight the extent to which aristocratic women occupied consequential positions within power structures, despite formal limitations on their authority. The Tower of London thus emerges not merely as a backdrop for individual tragedies, but as an institutional instrument through which the English state managed uncertainty. The imprisonment of noble women reveals a governance strategy reliant on containment, surveillance, and symbolic demonstration of control. Within its walls, personal identity intersected with political calculation, transforming private lives into matters of state concern. The surviving traces of these experiences, letters, financial accounts, legal records, and chroniclers' observations, offer a restrained yet revealing portrait of confinement shaped by status, gender, and the persistent instability of power. The transition from confinement to interrogation represented one of the most consequential phases of imprisonment for noble women held within the Tower. Surviving examination records indicate that questioning often focused less on direct evidence of wrongdoing and more on networks of association, correspondence, and perceived loyalty. Authorities sought to map relationships that might sustain opposition, and noble women's roles as intermediaries within kinship and patronage systems made them particularly valuable sources of information. Interrogations were frequently conducted with an awareness that testimony could influence broader political investigations, placing prisoners in positions where silence, cooperation, or carefully measured responses each carried potential consequences. The methods of interrogation applied to noble women differed in important respects from those used on lower-status prisoners. Legal codes of the period reveal that torture required formal authorization and was not routinely applied to aristocratic women, though the threat of its use remained implicit. Instead, pressure was exerted through prolonged questioning, isolation, and the manipulation of uncertainty regarding family members. Surviving correspondence suggests that concern for relatives, especially husbands, children, or siblings also under suspicion, could intensify the psychological burden of confinement. This dynamic reinforced the effectiveness of interrogation strategies that relied on emotional leverage rather than physical coercion. Financial administration within the Tower further shaped the lived experience of imprisonment. Treasury records demonstrate that the Crown often charged prisoners for their maintenance, including lodging, food, guards, and attendants. For noble women whose assets were confiscated or restricted, these expenses could accumulate into significant debts. Chroniclers noted that the financial dimension of captivity extended beyond immediate discomfort, potentially affecting estates and inheritance. The economic consequences of imprisonment therefore functioned as an additional mechanism of control, limiting a prisoner's capacity to reassert influence, even if release was eventually granted. Communication represented both a lifeline and a point of vulnerability. Surviving letters reveal that imprisoned noble women frequently sought permission to correspond with monarchs, council members, or influential patrons. These appeals were often framed in language emphasizing humility, obedience, and repentance. However, state papers indicate that correspondence was closely monitored, delayed, or selectively transmitted. The regulation of communication allowed authorities to manage information flow while assessing the prisoner's attitude and potential threat. In some cases, intercepted letters became evidence within legal proceedings, demonstrating how the act of seeking assistance could simultaneously reinforce surveillance. Visitors to imprisoned noble women were carefully regulated, reflecting the Tower's function as a controlled political environment. Accounts from wardens and guards describe protocols governing who could enter, how long visits could last, and whether conversations were observed. The presence of attendants chosen by authorities, rather than the prisoner's household, further limited opportunities for private exchange. Yet surviving testimonies suggest that even brief visits carried significant emotional and political weight, offering reassurance, transmitting news, and occasionally facilitating negotiation through intermediaries. The management of visitation thus balanced humanitarian considerations with concerns about conspiracy and influence. The broader urban context of London contributed to the symbolic dimensions of noble women's imprisonment. Contemporary observers noted that the Tower's visibility along the Thames ensured that arrivals and departures could become public spectacles, reinforcing royal authority while shaping popular perception. Diplomatic reports from foreign ambassadors indicate that the imprisonment of prominent women attracted international attention, particularly when linked to succession disputes or religious conflict. The Tower therefore operated not only as a secure facility, but also as a site of political messaging directed toward domestic and foreign audiences. Religious practice continued to play a central role in the daily routines of many imprisoned noblewomen. Chaplain accounts and devotional writings suggest that access to religious services and spiritual counsel was generally permitted, though occasionally influenced by the prevailing confessional policies of the Crown. For prisoners accused of religious dissent, these interactions could become extensions of examination, with clergy serving both pastoral and investigative functions. Surviving texts indicate that spiritual reflection provided a framework through which prisoners articulated resilience, repentance, or quiet resistance, demonstrating how faith intersected with the emotional realities of confinement. The experiences of Margaret Pole, Countess of Salisbury, illustrate the prolonged uncertainty that could accompany imprisonment within the Tower. Arrested amid suspicions surrounding her family's connections to opposition movements, Margaret's confinement extended over years before her execution in 1541. Government records reveal limited formal charges for much of her imprisonment, reflecting a preventive approach rooted in perceived dynastic threat rather than immediate legal necessity. Chroniclers noted her advanced age and deteriorating health, emphasizing the contrast between her noble lineage and the vulnerability imposed by confinement. Her case underscores how imprisonment could function as a prolonged suspension of status, leaving prisoners in a state of unresolved political significance. Marriage negotiations frequently intersected with decisions regarding release or continued detention. Surviving diplomatic correspondence indicates that arranging marriages for imprisoned noblewomen could neutralize potential claims or integrate them into alliances deemed less threatening to the Crown. Such arrangements were not always voluntary, and legal records suggest that consent could be influenced by the prospect of regained freedom. The use of marriage as a political instrument highlights the extent to which noblewomen's personal lives remained subject to strategic considerations extending beyond the Tower's walls. Health conditions within the fortress varied according to accommodation, season, and individual circumstance. Medical references in household accounts mention treatments for fevers, digestive ailments, and complications associated with prolonged inactivity. The Tower's location near the river contributed to concerns about dampness and air quality, factors occasionally cited in petitions requesting relocation to less restrictive environments. Authorities sometimes granted transfers on medical grounds, though such decisions were balanced against security concerns. These records suggest that physical well-being formed part of ongoing negotiations between prisoners and officials, reflecting a recognition that deteriorating health could generate sympathy or political complications. The role of female attendants within the Tower environment adds further complexity to the experience of noblewomen's confinement. Wardrobe accounts and personnel lists indicate that attendants were often selected for loyalty to the Crown, effectively transforming them into agents of observation as well as support. This arrangement blurred distinctions between companionship and surveillance, shaping interpersonal dynamics within the prisoner's immediate surroundings. Yet surviving letters suggest that bonds of empathy occasionally developed, illustrating how shared gendered experiences could complicate rigid structures of authority. Periods of heightened political instability intensified the Tower's function as a repository for high-status prisoners. During succession crises or rebellions, noblewomen connected to rival factions were detained as precautionary measures intended to discourage opposition. Government memoranda reveal that authorities recognized the symbolic value of controlling prominent women whose presence outside custody might inspire resistance or legitimize alternative claims. The Tower thus became a strategic instrument within broader efforts to manage perception, deter mobilization, and maintain continuity of governance during uncertain transitions. Execution proceedings involving noblewomen were characterized by a carefully regulated combination of ceremony and restraint. Contemporary descriptions emphasize the limited audiences permitted to witness such events, reflecting concerns about public reaction and the preservation of aristocratic dignity. The logistical preparations recorded in administrative documents, including arrangements for scaffolding, clergy, and burial, demonstrate the extent to which executions were managed as controlled expressions of state authority. Even in death, noblewomen's status influenced the form and symbolism of the process, reinforcing hierarchical distinctions embedded within the justice system. Release from the Tower did not necessarily restore previous influence or security. Post-release surveillance, travel restrictions, and requirements to reside under supervision were common, as indicated by council orders and local administrative records. These measures allowed authorities to maintain oversight while presenting an appearance of clemency. For some noblewomen, release represented an opportunity to re-establish familial roles and estates, albeit within altered political landscapes that limited autonomy. For others, the experience of imprisonment left enduring reputational and financial consequences that shaped subsequent generations. The cumulative evidence surrounding noblewomen's imprisonment within the Tower reveals an environment defined by negotiation rather than uniform deprivation. Status afforded certain protections, yet it also intensified scrutiny, as lineage and influence heightened the perceived stakes of confinement. Surviving documentation portrays imprisonment as a multifaceted process involving legal examination, emotional endurance, economic management, and strategic adaptation. Through these experiences, the Tower functioned as a space where personal identity and state interest intersected with particular intensity, shaping outcomes that extended far beyond the fortress itself. The long-term consequences of imprisonment within the Tower of London extended well beyond the period of confinement itself, shaping both individual trajectories and broader political narratives. Surviving estate records and correspondence suggest that noblewomen who had experienced captivity often returned to lives marked by diminished influence, cautious reintegration into court society, or deliberate withdrawal from political visibility. The stigma attached to imprisonment could persist even in cases where formal accusations were never proven, reflecting a culture in which suspicion alone carried reputational weight. For families navigating inheritance and marriage negotiations, association with a former prisoner required careful management to preserve alliances and social standing. In some instances, imprisonment altered patterns of patronage that had previously defined a noblewoman's authority within her household and extended networks. Financial documents indicate that estates placed under temporary royal control during captivity were not always fully restored, creating lasting economic implications. The interruption of household administration also weakened the networks of dependents and clients who relied on aristocratic patronage for stability. Historians have noted that these disruptions reveal how the imprisonment of a single noblewoman could ripple outward, affecting communities connected through service, tenancy, and familial obligation. The Tower's use as a site for noblewomen's confinement also influenced evolving legal and administrative practices. Government correspondence demonstrates that counselors increasingly viewed preventive detention as a pragmatic tool during periods of uncertainty, particularly when direct prosecution risked political backlash or insufficient evidence. The imprisonment of high-status women allowed authorities to neutralize potential threats without immediate recourse to public trials, thereby maintaining flexibility in response to shifting circumstances. This practice illustrates a broader governance strategy in which detention functioned as an instrument of risk management embedded within the monarchy's exercise of prerogative power. Diplomatic implications frequently accompanied the confinement of prominent noblewomen, especially when prisoners possessed foreign connections or marital ties beyond England.